He said I wasn't ambitious enough. Then he told me where he'd already applied. I remember standing in the kitchen when he said it. I had just gotten home from a 10-hour shift at the hospital. My scrubs still smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria coffee, and I was trying to figure out if we had anything in the fridge worth cooking, and Marcus walked in from the living room with his laptop open and that look on his face, the one that meant he'd already made a decision and was only now telling me about it. I submitted an application to the Hargrove Group, he said. The senior analyst position. In Dallas. I turned around. Dallas? It's a 40% salary bump, Lydia. I sat down to have a container of leftover rice I'd been holding. We live in Cincinnati. I know where we live. And that was kind of how it always went with Marcus. He'd make a move, and then he'd tell me, and then he'd look at me like I was the unreasonable one for needing a minute to catch up. We'd been married 6 years by then. I was 34. I was a registered nurse at Mercy West Medical Center, working the surgical recovery floor, and I had been quietly taking prerequisites for nurse practitioner school at night for the past 8 months. I hadn't told Marcus yet. I was waiting until I had something concrete to show him. An acceptance letter. A plan. Something he couldn't dismiss with that slow, patient exhale he did whenever I brought up my own goals. I should have noticed that earlier. I noticed a lot of things too late. We didn't move to Dallas. Marcus didn't get the Hargrove position. But something shifted after that night, like a floorboard that buckles slightly when you step on it, and you know it's going to give eventually, you just don't know when. I want to tell this right, because it's easy to look back and make the whole thing sound like a movie. Like I always knew something was wrong. Like I was just waiting for the curtain to drop, but the truth is messier than that. The truth is that I loved Marcus for a long time, and loving someone makes you generous with your interpretations of their behavior. You explain things away. You give benefit of the doubt until the doubt is so heavy you can't lift it anymore. I met Marcus when I was 26. He was funny then, and confident in a way that felt like safety. He worked in financial consulting, and he knew how to talk about money like it was simple, which was attractive to me because money had never felt simple growing up. My mom raised me and my sister Bea on a nurse's aide salary in Louisville, Kentucky, and every month was a negotiation between bills and groceries. So when Marcus talked about Roth IRAs and equity portfolios and 5-year plans, I felt like I was finally somewhere stable. We got married when I was 28. The wedding was small. My mom cried. His parents flew in from Atlanta, and his mother Donna hugged me exactly once and then spent the reception talking to Marcus's college friends. I remember thinking that was just her personality. Reserved, professional. I told myself we'd warm up to each other over time. We didn't really warm up to each other. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first few years of our marriage were good, mostly. We bought a house in Hyde Park. I was promoted to charge nurse. Marcus got a senior position at his firm. We had a routine that felt like contentment, or at least I told myself it was contentment. We'd have dinner together 3 or 4 nights a week, and on weekends we'd go to the farmer's market on Sycamore Street and get those malted waffles from the stand near the entrance, and sometimes in the evenings we'd sit on the back porch and just exist together without saying much, and I thought that was what a good marriage felt like. Comfortable. Quiet. But Marcus started traveling more for work around year 3. Longer trips. Sometimes Monday through Friday, and when he came home he was distracted in a way that felt different from regular exhaustion. He was there physically, but somewhere else entirely, and when I'd try to talk about anything substantial, my classes, my future plans, what I wanted for us, he'd steer the conversation somewhere else or just get very quiet. And I'd feel this particular kind of loneliness that's worse than being actually alone, because you're sitting 3 feet from someone and still can't reach them. I enrolled in the nurse practitioner program at the University of Cincinnati in the spring. I told Marcus in March, 2 weeks after I got my acceptance letter. I made dinner, his favorite pot roast, which takes 4 hours, and I set the table and I told him. He looked at the acceptance letter for a long moment. "That's a big commitment," he said. "I know. I've been planning it for... When were you going to tell me you were applying?" I paused. "I wanted to make sure I got in first, so you made a major life decision without consulting me." That was how he said it. A major, my education, was something I needed to run past him for approval. I sat with that for a second, trying to find the fair interpretation, the way I always did. "I wanted it to be real before I brought it up," I said. "You know how you are about plans that aren't finalized." "I don't know how I am about plans," he said. "Tell me." And that was the end of the pot roast dinner. He didn't tell me I couldn't go. He wasn't that direct. What Marcus did instead was the slow drip of discouragement. A comment here, a question there, delivered in a tone that was always just reasonable enough that I couldn't call it sabotage. "Are you sure this is the right time? Do you know how competitive NP salaries actually are in this market? I just don't want you to burn yourself out." He had a way of framing his doubts as concern. It took me a long time to understand that concern can be a weapon when it's used selectively, always pointed at the things you want for yourself and never at the things he wanted for himself. I went to class anyway. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. I studied on Saturday mornings while Marcus slept in. I kept my grades high. I didn't talk about it much at home because the silence was easier than the comments, and I told myself that was fine, that was just how we worked, that not all support looks the same. I should have said something. I know that now. The thing about being a nurse is that you get very good at reading rooms. You walk into a space and within about 30 seconds, you've cataloged the energy, the body language, the things people aren't saying. It's a survival skill on the floor. Patients will tell you they're fine right up until they're not. So you learn to look past the words. But that skill had a blind spot, and the blind spot was my own home. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. His name was Priya. I found out on a Wednesday in November. Marcus had left his email open on the laptop in the study. The personal one, not the work one. And I wasn't snooping, I just sat down to use the computer, and it was right there. 14 months of messages. I closed the laptop. I went to the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub for I don't know how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. And then I went back and I read all of it. Priya worked at a firm in Chicago. They'd met at a conference. There was nothing ambiguous about any of it. There were dates and hotel names and inside jokes that had the particular texture of a relationship that's been going on long enough to develop its own language. There was a message from 8 months ago where she asked if he'd told me yet, and he said soon, and then there was a message from 3 months ago where she asked again, and he said, "The timing isn't right." I closed the laptop again. I made the bed. I put a load of laundry in. I drove to the hospital and worked my shift and took care of 4 post-op patients and didn't say a word to anyone. And on the drive home, I stopped at the Walgreens on Erie and sat in the parking lot and called my sister Bea. "Bea?" I said. She knew from the way I said her name. That's the thing about sisters. "Where are you?" she said. "Walgreens on Erie." "Stay there." "I'm coming." She lived 20 minutes away. She was there in 15. She sat in my passenger's seat, and I told her everything, and she didn't say a word until I was done, and then she said, "What do you need right now?" I told her I didn't know yet. "Then we'll figure it out," she said. "But you don't have to figure it out tonight." I didn't confront Marcus that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the confrontation to be immediate. The righteous anger, the throwing things, the cinematic moment of reckoning. What actually happened is that I went home, and Marcus was already asleep, and I lay on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the fact that I had been studying for a pharmacology exam while my husband was planning hotel weekends in Chicago, and I didn't feel the anger yet. Not really. What I felt was something colder than anger. Something that already knew what had to happen and was just waiting for the rest of me to catch up. I spent 2 weeks gathering what I needed. I know that sounds calculated, and maybe it was, but I'd been a nurse long enough to know that the worst time to make decisions is in the middle of acute crisis. You stabilize first. You assess. You figure out what's actually happening before you move. I pulled our joint bank statements and discovered that over the past 14 months, Marcus had transferred a total of $31,400 to an account I'd never seen before. Not in one large transaction that might have flagged something. In careful, incremental amounts. $800 here, $2,200 there, always within the range of what we each managed without discussing. My name was on the joint account. The money going out was partially mine. We'd both been depositing into it for 6 years. I called a family law attorney named Catherine Reeves. She had a small practice off Madison Road and a reputation in the Cincinnati legal community that 3 different nurses at my hospital had mentioned over the years when the subject of divorce came up in the break room. I sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon and put the bank statements on her desk, and she looked at them without reacting, and then she looked at me and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." I told her everything from the beginning. By the time I was done, she'd filled 4 pages of a yellow legal pad. "You're going to be okay," she said. I believed her. I don't know exactly why, but I believed her. I confronted Marcus on a Friday evening. He came home from work and I was sitting at the kitchen table. Not waiting in an accusatory way, just sitting with a cup of tea in a room with the lights on. And he came in and looked at me, and I think he knew immediately, the way people know things they've been dreading. I told him I'd seen the emails. I told him I knew about Priya. I told him I knew about the $31,400. He sat down. He didn't deny any of it. What he said was, "Lydia, I've been unhappy for a long time." And there it was. The thing he'd been carrying around for, how long? Long enough to transfer money incrementally into a separate account. Long enough to build a second relationship with its own language and hotel reservations and a whole schedule that ran parallel to our life. He'd been unhappy, and instead of telling me, he'd just started making exit arrangements, quietly, over 14 months, while I made pot roast and went to pharmacology class and lay next to him in our bed. I haven't been happy either, I told him, but I wasn't doing this. He didn't have anything to say to that. The divorce took 8 months. Catherine Reeves was, as advertised, exceptional. We had 6 years of marital assets to divide, the house, the investment accounts, 2 cars, the joint savings. The $31,400 became a central issue. In Ohio, dissipation of marital assets is taken seriously, and Catherine documented everything. Marcus's attorney tried to characterize the transfers as legitimate personal expenses. Catherine's response to that argument was what I can only describe as methodical destruction. We settled out of court. I kept the house. I received a settlement that reflected the full value of what had been taken, and then some. I won't pretend the 8 months were easy. They weren't. There were nights when I'd get home from a double shift and sit in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes because going inside felt like too much. There were mornings when I'd wake up at 4 a.m. with my heart pounding over nothing specific, just the weight of a life in the middle of being reorganized. Bia called me every other day. My friend Danny, who I've known since nursing school, brought over food she pretended was accidental leftovers. My mom drove up from Louisville twice and didn't give me advice. She just sat with me, which was exactly what I needed. I also kept going to class, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. That didn't change. Maybe that was stubbornness, or maybe it was the one thing that felt like forward momentum when everything else was uncertain. I'd sit in those classroom chairs still in my work clothes sometimes, smelling like the hospital, taking notes on advanced pathophysiology, and I'd think about the version of myself who had hidden the acceptance letter for 2 weeks before telling my husband, and I'd feel something. Not exactly anger, but something adjacent to it, a kind of clarity. I finished the nurse practitioner program 18 months after the divorce was finalized. It was a 2-year program, but I'd started before everything fell apart, so I crossed the graduation stage in May with a class I'd come to know well. People who had sat next to me through the hardest year and a half of my life without knowing most of what was happening. My mom sat in the 3rd row. Bea cried before I even walked out. Danny yelled something embarrassing when my name was called that made the people around her laugh. I passed my certification boards on the first attempt. I accepted a position as a nurse practitioner at a cardiology practice in Blue Ash, a specialty I'd chosen deliberately because cardiac care had always been the area where I felt most competent, most focused, most like myself. The starting salary was just under $118,000. I negotiated it to $124,000. Catherine Reeves had taught me something about not leaving money on the table. 6 months after I started the cardiology position, the practice was featured in a Cincinnati magazine piece about innovative care models in the region. They interviewed several of the practitioners. I was photographed in my office, white coat, stethoscope, the window behind me, looking out over a sky that had turned that particular shade of October blue that makes everything look more serious than it is. The piece ran in the November issue. I didn't know Marcus had seen it until my phone rang on a Sunday afternoon in November. It was an unfamiliar number with an Atlanta area, and I almost didn't pick up. I picked up. Lydia. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, which was strange because I'd somehow expected it to sound different. Smaller, maybe. Marcus, I said. There was a pause. I saw the article. Okay. Another pause. I wanted to say, I think I owe you an apology that I never actually gave you. I was standing in my kitchen in the house that was now entirely mine, that I'd repainted over the summer in colors I'd chosen without consulting anyone. And I looked out the window at the backyard where the oak tree had dropped most of its leaves already, and I thought about what I wanted to say. Marcus, I said, I don't need the apology. Not because I'd stopped being hurt, or because what happened hadn't mattered, but because I'd stopped needing something from him to be okay. That's the thing no one tells you about this kind of ending. The goal isn't to get to the point where it doesn't hurt. The goal is to get to the point where you don't need anything from the person who hurt you. Not an explanation. Not an apology. Not their acknowledgement of who you became after they left. I already knew who I was. I hope you're doing well, I said, and I meant it, the way you mean it, about someone who is no longer part of your life in any real direction, who exists now in a different quadrant of the world you live in. I hung up. I poured myself a cup of coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought at an estate sale after Marcus moved out, solid walnut, the kind of table that looks like it has already survived something. And I opened my laptop, and I looked at the work I'd brought home from the office, the patient charts and the care plans, and the notes I'd made in the margins of a journal article about emerging protocols in heart failure management. My grandmother had been a practical woman. She grew up in eastern Kentucky in conditions that I still find hard to fully picture, and she had worked most of her adult life and raised children mostly on her own, as she used to tell me. She told me this often enough that it became a refrain. Something I could hear in her voice without trying. She used to say, "Lydia, A person can talk about you as long as they want. They can't live your life for you. I heard her saying it in my kitchen that November afternoon. I hear her saying it still. I kept the walnut table. I kept the oak tree in the backyard. I kept my Tuesday and Thursday evenings. They're different now, less studying, more reading for pleasure, more sitting in the particular quiet of a house that belongs to you. And I kept my name, which I'd never changed, which had been my grandmother's name before it was mine, which I'd carried all the way from Louisville to Cincinnati to a cardiology practice in Blue Ash to a page in a magazine, and which still sits above my office door in letters I see every morning when I arrive. I think about the woman who sat in the Walgreens parking lot on Erie Avenue and called her sister because she didn't know what else to do. I think about her the way you think about a version of yourself you've moved past, with something that isn't quite sympathy and isn't quite distance, but somewhere between. She was doing the best she could with what she had. She was figuring out what she needed. She figured it out.